I taught constitutional law for 10 years. I take the Constitution very seriously. The biggest problems that we're facing right now have to do with George Bush trying to bring more and more power into the executive branch and not go through Congress at all. And that's what I intend to reverse when I'm President of the United States of America.
When Congress offers you a bill, do you promise not to use presidential signage to get your way?
Yes. Let me just explain for those who are unfamiliar with this issue. We've got a government designed by the founders so that there'd be checks and balances. You don't want a president who's too powerful, or a Congress who's too powerful, or a courts who's too powerful. Everybody's got their own role. Congress's job is to pass legislation. The president can veto it or he can sign it. But what George Bush has been trying to do as part of his effort to accumulate more power in the presidency is he's been saying, well, I can basically change what Congress passed by attaching a letter saying, I don't agree with this part or I don't agree with that part. I'm going to choose to interpret it this way or that way. That's not part of his power. But this is part of the whole theory of George Bush, that he can make laws as he's going along. I disagree with that. I taught the Constitution for 10 years. I believe in the Constitution, and I will obey the Constitution of the United States. We're not going to use signing statements as a way of doing an end run around Congress. All right? There are those in the immigrants' rights community who have argued passionately that we should simply provide those who are illegally with legal status, or at least ignore the laws on the books and put an end to deportation until we have better laws. But I believe such an indiscriminate approach would be both unwise and unfair. It would suggest to those thinking about coming here illegally that there will be no repercussions for such a decision. And this could lead to a surge in more illegal immigration. And it would also ignore the millions of people around the world who are waiting in line to come here legally. Ultimately, our nation, like all nations, has the right and obligation to control its borders and set laws for residency and citizenship. The 11 million who broke these laws should be held accountable. I do have an obligation to make sure that I'm following some of the rules. I can't simply ignore laws that are out there. I've got to work to make sure that they are changed.
First of all, temporary protective status historically has been used for special circumstances where you have immigrants to this country who are fleeing persecution in their countries, or there's some emergency situation in their native land that required them to come to the United States. So it would not be appropriate to use that just for a particular group that came here primarily, for example, because they were looking for economic opportunity. With respect to the notion that I can just suspend deportations through executive order, that's just not the case, because there are laws on the books that Congress has passed, and I know that everybody here at Bell is studying hard, so you know that we've got 3 branches of government. Congress passes the law. The executive branch's job is to enforce and implement those laws, and then the judiciary has to interpret the laws. There are enough laws on the books by Congress that are very clear in terms of how we have to enforce our immigration system, that for me to simply, through executive order, ignore those congressional mandates would not conform with my appropriate role as president.
I can't do it by myself. We're going to have to change laws in Congress, but I'm confident we can make it happen. I know some here wish that I could just bypass Congress and change the law myself. But that's not how democracy works. See, democracy is hard, but it's right.
Changing our laws means doing the hard work of changing minds and changing votes one by one. And sometimes when I talk to immigration advocates, they wish I could just bypass Congress and change the law myself. But that's not how democracy works. What we really need to do is to keep up the fight to pass genuine, comprehensive reform. That is the ultimate solution to this problem. That's what I'm committed to doing. Now, I swore an oath to uphold the laws on the books. Now, I know some people want me to bypass Congress and change the laws on my own. Believe me, the idea of doing things on my own is very tempting. I promise you, not just on immigration reform. But that's not how our system works. That's not how our democracy functions. That's not how our Constitution is written.
This notion that somehow I can just change the laws unilaterally is just not true. But the fact of the matter is there are laws on the books that I have to enforce. And I think there's been a great disservice done to the cause of getting the DREAM Act passed and getting comprehensive immigration passed by perpetrating the notion that somehow by myself I can go and do these things. It's just not true. But we live in a democracy. You have to pass bills through the legislature, and then I can sign it. And if all the attention is focused away from the legislative process, then that is going to lead to a constant dead end. We have to recognize how the system works and then apply pressure to those places where votes can be gotten, and ultimately we can get this thing solved.
That's the law that's on the books right now. And the way our system works, the president doesn't have the authority to simply ignore Congress and say, we're not going to enforce the laws that you've passed.
But ultimately, I'm one man. We live in a democracy. We don't live in a monarchy. I'm not the king. I'm the president. And so I can only implement those laws that are passed through Congress.
What I've always said is, as the head of the executive branch, there's a limit to what I can do. Until we have a law in place that provides a pathway for legalization and or citizenship for the folks in question, we're going to continue to be bound by the law, and that's a challenge. We are a nation of immigrants, but we're also a nation of laws. So what I've said is we need to fix a broken immigration system, and I've done everything that I can on my own. As I said, I think previously, I'm not a king. I am the head of the executive branch of government. I'm required to follow the law, and that's what we've done. I'm the President of the United States. I'm not the Emperor of the United States. My job is to execute laws that are passed. And Congress right now has not changed what I consider to be a broken immigration system. And what that means is that we have certain obligations to enforce the laws that are in place, even if we think that in many cases the results may be tragic. My job in the executive branch is supposed to be to carry out the laws that are passed. Congress has said, here's the law when it comes to those who are undocumented, and they allocate a whole bunch of money for enforcement. A legal argument that I think is absolutely right, which is that given the resources we have, we can't do everything that Congress has asked us to do. What we can do is then carve out the DREAM Act folks. But if we start broadening that, then essentially I would be ignoring the law in a way that I think would be very difficult to defend legally. So that's not an option. And I do get a little worried that advocates of immigration reform start losing heart and immediately thinking, well, somehow there's an out here. If Congress doesn't act, we'll just have the president sign something and that'll take care of it. We won't have to worry about it. What I've said is that there's a path to get this done, and that's through Congress. If, in fact, I could solve all these problems without passing laws in Congress, then I would do so. But we're also a nation of laws. That's part of our tradition. And so the easy way out is to try to yell and pretend like I can do something by violating our laws. And what I'm proposing is the harder path, which is to use our democratic processes to achieve the same goal that you want to achieve. But it won't be as easy as just shouting. It requires us lobbying and getting it done.
Thank you, Mr. President. When you were running for president, you said, quote, "The biggest problems we're facing right now have to do with George Bush trying to bring more and more power into the executive branch and not go through Congress at all, and that's what I intend to reverse." So my question to you, has Congress's inability to do anything significant given you a green light to push the limits of executive power, even a duty to do so, or put another way, does it bother you more to be accused of being an imperial president pushing those limits, or to be accused of being a do-nothing president who couldn't get anything done because you faced dysfunctional Congress?
Well, I think that I never have a green light. I'm bound by the Constitution. I'm bound by separation of powers. There's some things we can't do. Congress has the power of the purse, for example. When you look at, for example, congressional inaction, and in particular, the inaction on the part of House Republicans when it comes to immigration reform, in the face of that kind of dysfunction, what I can do is, scour our authorities to try to make progress. And we're going to make sure that every time we take one of these steps, that we are working within the confines of my executive power.
Does the president still stand by what he said last year when he said, quote, "I am not the Emperor of the United States. My job is to execute laws that are passed"? Is that still operative?
Absolutely.
Not a king either.
That's right.
Because he was asked very specifically about the idea of expanding the deferred action executive order for the Dreamers to their parents. And he said September 17th last year, Telemundo, very clearly, if we start broadening that, then essentially I would be ignoring the law in a way that would make it very difficult to defend legally, so that is not an option. Is that still operative when the president said specifically that expanding the DACA executive order is not an option because it would be ignoring the law? Does he still believe that?
Well, John, I don't want to get ahead of what any sort of announcements that the president may make before the end of the year about executive actions that he may take to fix our broken immigration system. Since this interview aired, the president did direct the Attorney General and the Secretary of Homeland Security to conduct a review of the law to determine what, if any, authority he could use to try to fix some of the problems that House Republicans have refused to address. So this is something that has been under consideration for some time by the Attorney General of the United States and by the Secretary of Homeland Security.
So just to be clear, so you're saying that this is no longer operative because we've had a review. So when the president said that expanding DACA to apply to the parents of the Dreamers, for instance, would be broadening and essentially ignoring the law in a way that would be difficult to defend legally, that it's not an option, that statement is no longer operative.
Well, what I'm saying is we'll have an opportunity to evaluate the actions that the president has chosen to take after he's announced.
But I'm not asking about the options. I'm just saying, does the president still stand by what he said in that interview in September of last year?
Well, John, obviously there are some things that have changed with this.
Yeah.
Well, it's not. Obviously, there have some things that have changed, right? We have been in a situation where the president has ordered a broader, in-depth review of the existing law to determine what sort of executive authority does rest with the presidency to determine what kinds of steps he could take on his own.
So I know he's been after some Obama's trying to do an end run around Congress.